The internet did something extraordinary to the world. Quietly, almost innocently, it dissolved borders that had defined human interaction for centuries. A message written in one corner of the planet could appear instantly on a screen thousands of miles away. Ideas flowed freely, knowledge became abundant, communities formed without geography. A teenager in Vietnam could learn from a professor in California. A freelancer in Argentina could work for a startup in Berlin. The internet didn't ask for passports. It didn't care about flags. It simply connected. And yet, in the middle of this borderless digital universe, one thing stubbornly refused to evolve at the same pace: money. We could communicate globally, collaborate globally, even build global businesses. But when it came time to move value, suddenly the old world snapped back into place. Banks, borders, exchange rates, delays, fees, permissions. A simple international transfer could take days, sometimes weeks, routed through layers of institutions that had little to do with the actual people involved. The internet moved at the speed of light. Money moved at the speed of bureaucracy. This wasn't a technical limitation. It was a historical one. For most of human history, money has never been a neutral tool. It has always been inseparable from power. Kings stamped their faces onto coins to assert authority. Empires enforced currencies to control trade. Modern nation states issue money not just as a medium of exchange, but as an extension of sovereignty. Every national currency is, at its core, a political instrument. It reflects borders, laws, central banks, and policy decisions made within a specific territory. And that made sense for a world organized around geography. But the internet didn't care about geography. The digital world grew into something humanity had never experienced before: a shared global space. Not international, but supranational. Not owned, but collectively maintained. A realm where participation was permissionless and identity was fluid. Yet the money we used inside this space was still designed for a world of customs checkpoints and central clearinghouses. This mismatch created friction everywhere. Think about a small creator uploading content to a global platform. Their audience might span dozens of countries, but their income must pass through payment processors, currency conversions, and compliance layers that extract value at every step. Or consider someone living in a country with unstable monetary policy, trying to save in a world where their labor competes globally, but their currency collapses locally. The internet gave them access to the world, but their money kept pulling them back. For decades, we tried to patch this problem instead of solving it. Credit cards, wire transfers, correspondent banks, digital wallets. Each innovation promised speed and convenience, but always within the same underlying structure. Money still needed intermediaries. Trust was still centralized. Control remained firmly in the hands of institutions tied to nation-states. Even so-called digital money was mostly just digital representations of national currencies, moving through legacy rails. It was like building skyscrapers on top of horse roads. What was missing wasn't faster banks or better apps. What was missing was a form of money native to the internet itself, not money adapted for the internet. Money born from it. This is where Bitcoin enters the story, not as a rebellion, not as an accident, but as an inevitability. Bitcoin didn't start with a country. It didn't launch with a central authority. It didn't ask anyone for permission. It emerged from the same ethos that shaped the early internet: open protocols, voluntary participation, and trust built through mathematics instead of institutions. In a world where information could flow freely but value could not, Bitcoin proposed a radical idea. What if money worked like the internet works? What if value could move as freely as an email? This idea wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Bitcoin challenged an assumption so deeply ingrained that most people never questioned it: that money must belong to a nation. That money must be issued, controlled, and validated by a central power. Bitcoin asked something much simpler and much more unsettling. What if money belonged to the network instead? In the early days, this question sounded absurd. Governments print money. Central banks manage economies. How could a decentralized system running on computers scattered across the world possibly replace centuries of monetary tradition? But Bitcoin wasn't trying to replace nations. It was solving a different problem altogether. The internet didn't replace countries either. It didn't abolish borders. It simply created a new layer of reality above them. a layer where people could interact without constantly negotiating sovereignty. Bitcoin follows the same pattern. It doesn't deny the existence of national currencies. It operates in a different dimension, one where value moves globally by default. This distinction matters. Bitcoin is not anti-national. It is post-national. It exists because the internet exists. Because once humans built a global, permissionless communication network, the absence of a corresponding monetary system became impossible to ignore. Bitcoin filled that void. In this sense, Bitcoin is less like a revolution and more like gravity. Once the conditions were right, it had to happen. The question is no longer why Bitcoin exists. The real question is why it took us so long to realize that the internet needed its own money. And once you see that, everything else about Bitcoin begins to look very different. To understand Bitcoin properly, you have to stop thinking about it as a better version of traditional money. Bitcoin is not a faster bank, a smarter payment app, or a digital upgrade to existing currencies. It is something far more fundamental. Bitcoin is a protocol, and protocols don't ask for permission from the world they reshape. The internet itself did not succeed because it was owned by a powerful institution. It succeeded because no one owned it. Email did not win because postal services adopted it. It won because anyone could use it without approval. TCP/IP did not replace closed corporate networks by force. It simply worked better in an open, global environment. Bitcoin follows this same lineage. It was designed not to fit inside the old financial system, but to exist independently of it. At its core, Bitcoin behaves the way the internet behaves. Anyone can connect. Anyone can verify. Anyone can participate. There is no central server. There is no headquarters. There is no CEO. The Bitcoin network exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time, spread across thousands of nodes operated by individuals who do not need to trust one another. The rules are not enforced by authority, but by consensus. The system works not because someone says it should, but because everyone can independently verify that it does. This is a profound shift. Traditional money depends on trust in institutions. You trust that a central bank will not print too much. You trust that intermediaries will not freeze your account. You trust that governments will respect property rights. Bitcoin replaces this trust with something colder, but far more reliable: math and open source code. In Bitcoin, you don't need to know who runs the system. You only need to know how it works. This is why Bitcoin feels strange to people trained in traditional finance. It doesn't behave like a company, a state, or a commodity. It behaves like a network, and networks obey different laws. They grow organically. They resist control. They route around damage. They don't collapse when one node fails. Think about email again. When you send an email, you don't ask which country's server will approve it. You don't worry about which company owns the protocol. You don't need a license to participate. The message simply moves across the network, hopping from node to node until it reaches its destination. Bitcoin transactions move the same way. Value is broadcast, verified, and settled globally without asking for permission. This is why Bitcoin is often misunderstood as stateless. It's not that Bitcoin rejects states. It simply doesn't require them. And that distinction changes everything. National currencies are optimized for domestic policy. They are tools for managing inflation, employment, debt, and political priorities within borders. Bitcoin is optimized for something else entirely: global value transfer in a digital environment. It doesn't care where you live. It doesn't adjust itself to local economic conditions. It treats every participant the same, whether they are a hedge fund in New York or a student with a smartphone in Lagos. This neutrality is not a flaw. It is the point. The internet needed a neutral money because the internet itself is neutral. Once you introduce national currencies into a global network, you also import geopolitical power imbalances, monetary policy spillovers, and gatekeepers who decide who gets access and on what terms. Bitcoin removes these layers, not by confrontation, but by irrelevance. It doesn't lobby governments. It doesn't negotiate regulations. It simply exists, open to anyone who wants to use it. This is why attempts to describe Bitcoin purely as an investment miss the deeper story. Price is a side effect, not the essence. What gives Bitcoin its power is not volatility or scarcity alone, but its alignment with the architecture of the internet. It is money that assumes a global audience by default. Money that treats borders as metadata, not barriers. And because it is native to the internet, Bitcoin scales with the internet. As more people come online, Bitcoin doesn't need to expand into new jurisdictions or strike partnerships with banks. It simply gains more nodes, more users, more resilience. Just like the internet grew without asking permission from telecom monopolies, Bitcoin grows without asking permission from central banks. This doesn't mean Bitcoin is perfect. No protocol ever is. The internet itself is messy, inefficient, and often chaotic. But it works because it is open, because anyone can build on top of it without approval. Bitcoin offers the same foundation for money. Developers don't need a license to create wallets. Entrepreneurs don't need a bank charter to build financial services on top of it. Individuals don't need an account to hold it. Ownership is direct, not delegated. This is what it means to say Bitcoin belongs to the internet. Not because it lives online, but because it inherits the internet's values: openness, decentralization, censorship resistance, and global reach. It is money that assumes a world where people interact directly across borders without intermediaries deciding who is allowed to participate. In that world, asking which nation Bitcoin belongs to is like asking which nation owns the internet. It's the wrong question. Bitcoin doesn't compete with national currencies on their own turf. It operates in a different layer altogether. A layer where geography fades, identities blur, and value moves as freely as information. And once you see Bitcoin this way, not as a challenger to states, but as the monetary protocol of the internet, its existence stops being controversial. It becomes obvious. When something does not fit neatly into existing categories, the first reaction is almost always suspicion. Bitcoin, by refusing to belong to any nation, triggered exactly that response. Governments asked a familiar question: who controls it? When no clear answer emerged, discomfort followed. Because for nation-states, money without a controller is not just unusual, it is unsettling. For centuries, monetary sovereignty has been one of the core pillars of state power. Control over money means control over taxation, spending, debt, and ultimately social order. When a government issues currency, it does more than enable trade. It shapes incentives, absorbs shocks, and projects authority. From this perspective, Bitcoin looks like an anomaly at best and a threat at worst. So the early narrative was almost inevitable. Bitcoin was labeled a tool for criminals, a playground for speculators, a bubble waiting to burst. It was framed as unstable, dangerous, or irresponsible. Not because these labels fully described reality, but because they helped place Bitcoin into familiar boxes. If it could be reduced to a problem, then it could be managed. If it could be criminalized, then it could be controlled. But Bitcoin was never designed to fit inside those boxes. The resistance it encountered was not really about technology or even economics. It was about worldview. Bitcoin emerged from a network-based model of coordination, while governments operate through hierarchical models of authority. These two systems speak different languages. One relies on permission, the other on verification. One draws borders, the other ignores them. When Bitcoin moves value across borders in minutes, it doesn't ask whether capital controls exist. When someone self-custodies their savings, it doesn't check compliance frameworks. This is not defiance. It is indifference. And indifference is often more disruptive than opposition. Yet there is an irony at the heart of this conflict. Bitcoin does not actually remove power from states in the way critics often imagine. It does not dismantle tax systems overnight. It does not replace courts, laws, or institutions. What it does is offer an alternative for those who need one. And alternatives are only threatening when the existing system fails to serve everyone equally. To see this clearly, you have to look beyond stable economies. In countries with low inflation, strong institutions, and reliable banking systems, Bitcoin often appears abstract. It is discussed as an investment, a hedge, or a speculative asset. But in countries facing currency devaluation, capital restrictions, or political instability, Bitcoin is not an ideology. It is infrastructure. For someone whose savings are eroded year after year by inflation, Bitcoin represents time stored more honestly. For someone whose bank account can be frozen without warning, Bitcoin represents ownership without permission. For someone excluded from the global financial system entirely, Bitcoin represents access. These people are not rejecting their nations. They are trying to survive within them. This is where the misunderstanding deepens. Bitcoin is often framed as a rebellion against the state, but for many users, it is simply a neutral tool in an unfair landscape. Just as the internet allowed people to bypass state controlled media without abolishing journalism, Bitcoin allows people to bypass broken monetary systems without abolishing governments. The clash, then, is not between Bitcoin and nations, but between two different scales of organization. Nation states are optimized for governing territory. Bitcoin is optimized for coordinating value in a global digital network. When these two systems intersect, friction is unavoidable. But friction does not mean incompatibility. It means boundaries are being tested. Some governments respond by trying to ban Bitcoin. Others attempt to regulate it. A few try to imitate it by creating digital versions of their own currencies. Each response reveals the same underlying realization. Something fundamental has changed. Money is no longer confined to physical space. Bitcoin doesn't wait for legal recognition to function. It doesn't stop at borders. It doesn't slow down because a central authority disapproves. Like the internet, it routes around obstacles. Where it is restricted, it becomes more resilient. Where it is understood, it integrates quietly. This pattern is familiar. The internet faced similar resistance in its early years. It was feared, restricted, and misunderstood. Over time, it became unavoidable. Not because it defeated governments, but because it offered too much utility to ignore. Bitcoin is following the same arc. As nations experiment, resist, and adapt, a deeper truth emerges. Bitcoin is not competing for sovereignty. It is redefining the terrain where sovereignty matters. It operates in a space that did not previously exist, where traditional tools of control are less effective. This doesn't mean states disappear. It means their role evolves. Just as governments eventually learn to govern a world with the internet, they will learn to govern a world with Bitcoin. Not by owning it, but by coexisting with it. Not by controlling the protocol, but by building policies around a reality they did not create. And in that reality, Bitcoin remains what it has always been. Not an enemy of nations, but a mirror reflecting the limits of national money in a global digital age. The tension we see today is not a crisis. It is a transition, and transitions by nature are uncomfortable. As the noise around Bitcoin rises and falls, it's easy to assume the story must end with a single winner. Either Bitcoin replaces national currencies or it fades into irrelevance. But history rarely moves in such clean lines. New technologies don't usually erase the old ones. They change the context in which the old ones operate. The internet didn't eliminate newspapers, phones, or television. It changed their roles. It became the base layer upon which everything else evolved. Bitcoin is best understood in the same way, not as a universal replacement for money, but as a new monetary layer designed for a world that already lives online. In that future, national currencies do not vanish. They continue to serve local economies, public spending, taxation, and domestic policy. They remain tools of governance. Bitcoin, however, serves a different purpose. It functions as a neutral settlement layer for a global digital civilization. This distinction matters because it resolves much of the fear surrounding Bitcoin. Bitcoin does not need to be used for every coffee purchase to be successful. It does not need to price every asset or replace every bank. Its role is quieter and deeper. It provides a form of value that is not tied to the fate, policies, or politics of any single nation. In a world increasingly defined by global interaction, that neutrality is not radical. It is necessary. Consider how people already use the internet today. A designer in one country collaborates with a company in another. A developer contributes to open source software used worldwide. A creator builds an audience that spans continents. These relationships are global by default, yet the financial systems supporting them remain fragmented and fragile. Bitcoin offers a shared monetary language for these interactions, not imposed, chosen. This is why Bitcoin increasingly resembles digital gold rather than digital cash. Gold was never everyday money for most people. It was a base layer of trust, a store of value that existed beyond any single ruler's decree. Bitcoin plays a similar role for the internet age. It anchors value in a system where trust is distributed, not granted. And like gold, its strength lies in what it does not do. Bitcoin does not change its supply based on political pressure. It does not adjust itself to win elections or finance deficits. It does not respond to emergencies with improvisation. These limitations, often criticized as rigidity, are precisely what make Bitcoin reliable in a global context. Predictability becomes a feature when trust is scarce. As digital life expands, this reliability becomes more important, not less. We are entering an era where identity, work, culture, and even communities exist increasingly in digital space. Virtual worlds, decentralized organizations, global creator economies, all of these require a way to store and transfer value that does not depend on any single jurisdiction. Bitcoin fits this role not because it is perfect, but because it is independent. This independence is its defining trait. Bitcoin does not need to defeat governments to succeed. It only needs to remain open, neutral, and resilient. Its competition is not fiat currencies, but fragmentation, not central banks, but friction. Wherever value needs to move freely across borders, Bitcoin quietly proves its relevance. Over time, this changes how people think about money itself. Money stops being something that belongs to a country and becomes something that belongs to a network. Savings become portable. Ownership becomes direct. Trust shifts from institutions to protocols. This doesn't eliminate the nation state, but it reduces the cost of being human in a global world. And perhaps that is Bitcoin's most overlooked contribution. It gives people an option, not a mandate, not a revolution, just an alternative system that exists alongside the old one, an escape hatch for those who need it, a foundation for those building something new, a monetary layer native to the internet, just as email is native to communication and the web is native to information. So when we say Bitcoin is the currency of the internet, not of any nation, we are not making a political statement. We are making a descriptive one. Bitcoin belongs to the same realm as the internet itself, borderless, permissionless, and shared. It does not ask who you are or where you come from. It only asks whether you choose to participate. And in a world increasingly defined by networks rather than nations, that choice may turn out to be one of the most important features money has ever had.